Hi, everyone. Can you just give me a thumbs up online if you can hear?
Have you got
can? Yes, excellent. Right. Thank you. Now, we've still got a couple of people just joining online.
Oh, good, because we thought we were going to be late. We thought it'd take us.
Now, I'd like to begin by first acknowledging the traditional owners of the unceded lands on which we gather, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung and Bunurong Bunurong peoples, as well as the Yorta Yorta Nation and the Dja Dja Wurrung people, so traditional owners of the lands occupied by other University of Melbourne campuses. We pay respect to elders past and present, and we acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledges both within the Academy and in our wider communities. As a community of researchers, professional staff, teachers and students, we're obviously privileged to work on unceded Indigenous lands every day and with Indigenous colleagues and partners as well. For those of you who've flown into Melbourne in the past few days, you'll have noticed the dry brown country of Bitterrup, so the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung word for dry season, creating creeks and waterways and fissures of green in that brown landscape as well. Catherine here. Yeah. At the Global Childhoods Research Hub, we recognise the unique place held by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional owners and custodians of the land, skies and waterways with which we're privileged to teach each and every day. And we recognise the continuous connections to, knowledge of and care for country that has been part of First Nations traditions for over 60,000 years. In making this acknowledgement, I want to also recognise the important place of truth-telling within education. And on that note, for those of you who are still here tomorrow, there's a panel which will be discussing the frontier wars and the support or providing support to educators to teach and support them to authentically engage with Australia's frontier wars and teaching that. So if you'd like further information, I can give you information on that. Just before we get started, can everyone turn off their phones?
I thought I did. My apology. I thought I just turned it off and I just turned it on again. It's tomorrow. Yeah. So sorry, Anthony.
That's fine. Don't worry.
I literally.
It reminded everyone to do.
Yeah, that's right.
And my phone might be everything. That was a prank call. I never answered. It wasn't from anybody.
And we do have a couple of people online. We've got about 7 people joined online as well. So saying hi to all of them.
There.
Yeah.
And I'm for joining.
And if they would like to leave messages or questions in the chat,
they can do that. Yes, we can ask them. Would you like to do an introduction from Mariana?
Yes. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here today and to acknowledge my friend and colleague Mariana Souto, who's here from the Erickson Institute, and it's just lovely to have her. We were just saying time flies, and Mariana first came as a visiting scholar to Victoria University when we were there. What did we say? 2012. And I had met Mariana in New York when my granddaughter was born in 2009. And it seems like a lifetime ago. My granddaughter was about 16. It was very cold, I remember. She must have been a bit older then. But officially, Mariana is Professor Mariana Souto, PhD, is a renowned educator, scholar, and advocate for justice in early childhood education. As the president of the Erickson Institute in Chicago, she leads efforts to transform educational practices and systems to ensure equity and inclusion for children. Her work centers on challenging dominant narratives in education, promoting culturally sustainable pedagogies, and advocating for the rights of systematically excluded children, family, and communities. Mariana's research, publications, and leadership are grounded in a commitment to reimagine childhood in ways that honor every child's humanity and potential. And she's going, as you can see, talk to us today about whose childhood counts. And it's just so apropos everything that we've been thinking about in terms of global childhoods. And she's so well organized that she's even given me a paper that's got that we're hoping that we're going to put in our journal. Global studies of childhood. Global studies of childhood. I can hear what my own for a minute. But it's got to go through the review process.
Of course.
And it just seems, looking at the abstract, such an amazing topic. So thank you, Mariana. And Mariana was going to join us on Thursday at our symposium, but very sadly, her mother passed away suddenly. And last month, there were, and yes, we are in February, still not in March yet. And she has to return to Chicago tomorrow. We're just so privileged to have her here today, and we will definitely acknowledge her presence at the symposium on Thursday, very importantly.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's really humbling to be here to continue to learn and to continue to ask questions. As Nicholas said, I'm Mariana. I'm going to get started by reading something because I want to get it right, and then we'll talk about things. It's a prelude, and I think that was what led me to develop the full paper. I had done analysis and all of that, but this prelude brought things together. 1 week before my mother unexpectedly passed, she sent me a poignant video via WhatsApp. It wasn't unusual for her to send me inspiring messages, but this one felt different. The video, a short film by Valderez de Barros, Maju Lima, and Fernando Possani, was actually titled The Lipstick, but she retitled it The Future. And this video in it, a little girl walks with her father through a park, imagining adventures and defying limits. She asks her dad, "Can I go pick fruit, jabuticaba, up in Mr. John's farm, climbing the tree? Can I build sandcastles that go all the way to the sky and go to the beach? Can I eat ice cream?" She really relishes the audacity of childhood and tries to push limits. I'm going to try and show you the video so that you have an idea. I will try to translate in real time somewhat, but you will get the gist of it. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the meaning of that. So,
Nesse banco de novo.
O que você quer fazer?
Eu quero no sítio de Sítio. Eu gosto de
Mas o seu João vendeu o sítio. Como que a gente vai entrar lá?
Vendeu?
Vendeu.
Não tem que. Então, eu quero pra.
so I'm going to just say,
Você vai para o mar?
so she's saying, do I have to sit here?
Tá certo.
Can I go to the farm? Can I go to the beach and build this castle all the way to the sky? Maybe tomorrow. Tomorrow?
Isso a gente pode?
And ice cream, can we have?
Agora.
Agora.
Ice cream we can have now. That's great. Thank you. Can I put my lipstick on though? So she, of course, removed the lipstick. Who's this woman? This woman is you, my mother. And just like that, time collapses. The continuum of childhood unfolds before us, questioning where it begins, where it ends. And really, who gets to claim it? And who's denied it? My mother sent this video because she knew, even before I did, the ice cream, Mom. The ice cream. Oh, I love ice cream. Let's go. Just let me put stuff away. The ice cream. Love of my life. Let's go, love of my life. And they walk out. So I will close these, but
We just go back to the other one.
okay, that's. And these are the producers. I couldn't find outside of Facebook or Instagram. I'm still going to contact the producers, but these just happened like a mother passed like a minute ago. And so these were sent to me like five weeks ago. And so just like that, as I was reading, time collapses, the continuum of childhood unfolds right before us, questioning where it begins, where it ends, who gets to claim it, and who's denied it. My mother sent me this video because she knew, even before I did, that I needed to interrogate childhood's boundaries, not as an abstract concept, but as a mechanism of exclusion, control, and denial. Later, I sat with my own son, Thomas, reflecting on my mother's message. I showed him the video and asked him, what do you think this means? He looked up from his laptop and thought for a moment. maybe it's about how we never stop being kids, or how people decide when childhood should end. He was right. My mother's final lesson to me was about childhood's fluidity. A reminder that childhood is not just a biological stage, but a social construct, often used to determine who's afforded protection, innocence, and opportunity, and who's denied those things. This article and this presentation today is an extension of that talk, and I want to explore and dismantle some of those narrow definitions that shape our worldview and our very conceptualizations of childhoods. So, in doing so, I really want to question the boundaries of childhood. Who defines it? Who is excluded? Who is included? What are the terms of belonging in being a child and having the right to be a child? How do you perform? Is that performance different or similar than how you would perform otherwise? Are you watched as you enter a store? Are you deemed to be over-sexualized, dangerous? What are some of those constructions?
I'm
Let's-
just thinking
yeah.
like I'm not in presentation mode. I was in
Right.
presentation mode before, but now I
Yeah.
can't see the little icon.
Maybe just press escape. And
No, I don't.
no,
I was in there before. Is it okay to, oh, I can make it a bit bigger.
oh yeah,
Oh, no, oh, there it is,
all
but
right.
it's in presentation.
Okay,
No.
let's try again.
Try again.
Yeah.
Before it filled up the whole.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted.
And there's no other video. The rest of it is rather just basic because I finished writing this paper yesterday. And so it's pretty recent and pretty fresh. I did it for this specific context. So hopefully you will help me think with it, ask questions, push, because that's what this is all about. So childhood is often defined as a linear, idealized, universal stage, right? A child. When we think of a child, when we think of an infant, when we think of a toddler, we often think of this certain marker of time, temporal marker. Yet, it is also a cultural construct that shape policies related to childhood, related to access, laws, and societal norms. So the critical questions that I want to address is whose childhoods are protected, who's erased, who's criminalized, and who's denied childhoods. And we could talk about it, and I have my own thoughts. I mean, I've been in this career for like quarter century or more, but actually more, but let's not go there. But I wanted to think about which discourses and which conceptualizations of childhood have power. So the problem that I wanted to look at is that childhood is unequally distributed across race, class, and nationality. Right? I wrote, for example, in 2017, about play and who gets to play. Who gets to play with toy guns and or weapons and who doesn't? For whom is that a life-threatening experience? Also because there is systemic exclusion based on that in education, in law, and society. Think, for example, of the generations of Aboriginal people who were denied growing up with their families. Think about the residential schools within the context of the United States and Canada. So the key issues that I identified right away in terms of reading historically the literature were the adultification of Black children. Black children are always deemed to be older than they were, more dangerous, more, if they were girls, if they identified as girls or were identified by others as girls, they were over-sexualized. And they were blamed not because the clothes makers did not make clothes that fit their bodies, but because they were showing their butt cracks or whatever else, or their breasts. The criminalization of Indigenous youth in terms of lack of access. Okay, there's land theft, there's colonization, there's the theft of wealth, and all of that. And now we're criminalizing because we have divested communities. And then there is the bordering and exclusion of migrant and immigrant children that is more palpable today than it has been for many, many years. So I engaged in a really systematic literature review and identified 3 key theoretical frameworks that would allow me to start reimagining what childhood was, or could be, right? So critical childhood studies, which is childhood as a social, cultural, and social political construct. Post-colonial theory, which are the colonial legacies that shape childhood definitions. Why is it that Black children are not children? Because as soon as they were old enough to carry something, they were in the field working as enslaved Africans. Because as soon as they could work with cattle and the Aboriginal lands, they were put to work. And so there was this historical denial that pervades our construction today, but oftentimes we don't necessarily link the contemporary to the historical. We ask why. But it's very clear from history that those are remnants of settler colonialism. And then there's the politics of belonging and bordering. Who is included in childhood protections? Who is included in terms of access to schooling? Who is included in terms of access to health care? Who is included in terms of care? And how is that delivered? So in critical childhood studies, the three key concepts, and I will just breeze through those because I want to engage in a conversation, is that it deconstructs universal childhood narratives. There's no such a thing as a universal childhood. Yet, we often try to offer that a single definition of quality, a single definition of childhoods. And we don't recognize how, as Barbara Rogoff has documented, how if a child in a specific community in the Republic of Congo is handling a machete at age 2 with proficiency, if that is a skill that then becomes mandated and becomes standard, I would say most Australian and most American children would be deemed to be developmentally delayed if they didn't do that by 4. Yet in the US, in America, we don't even give butter knives, maybe plastic knives to children for them to manipulate. So that has to do with the universal, really imposition of normative colonial white norms onto every child. And so in that regard, that means that belonging becomes defined in those terms. For you to perform childhoods, you have to perform these white notion of childhood. It also examines systemic exclusions and inequities. And Fickley really has written quite a bit about that. What are the inequities in terms of access to nature? What are the inequities in terms of intergenerational knowledges? What are the inequities in terms of the time that you spend with loved ones or with those who look like you? If always you're entering classrooms and you're finding white teachers, that's inequitable to those who always see themselves represented and really develop that over-exaggerated sense of themselves and their place in the world versus always thinking of someone else. Like I often say, now people know because I've been president of Ericsson for 4 years, but like the first time that I did orientation, I sat for half a day in orientation as a participant. And the master's and doctoral students didn't know that I was president because I didn't look like president. Because a president was a white man or somebody older. And so we have those archetypes that we try to really forward. And in childhood, those archetypes really cement those exclusions and inequities. And also, critical childhood studies recognizes children's agency in meaning making. Children are not just recipients of knowledge. They're not passive. They're the most creative and ingenious beings, capable producers that oftentimes get bordered by adult expectations. In terms of post-colonial theory, childhood is a colonial tool for control and assimilation. And you may think, oh, this is too harsh. But at the same time, there has been the forced removal of Indigenous children through residential schools across multiple countries. And migration policies continue to perpetuate exclusion and surveillance. I remember, I don't know, another time that I was here, where there was a ship of Sri Lankan refugees that got stuck. And it's like, these are human beings. What are the policies and how are they honored or dishonoring the humanity? Who is deemed to belong as a child here and who's constructed as a criminal before even setting foot on Australian ground, even though that Australian ground belongs to the Aboriginal peoples. So the politics of belonging and bordering was the third lens that I used to really interrogate some of those discourses of power. And childhood is a contested and bordered category. So what are the terms of childhood? For whom are these terms ascribed? Who is immediately deemed to be a child and who isn't? If a child is a little bit big, for their size. If a child is 8, but we're size 14, is that child ascribed the label of child? For whom are they denied? And oftentimes the denial does come in those 3 categories of Blackness, indigeneity, and migrant immigrant. They come as really cloaks for the otherization and exclusion. And then who needs to perform, assimilate, or erase in order to have a childhood? So I am a Black boy who is boisterous and likes to play and all of that, but I know if I do that in the street, I may be seen as dangerous. And so I'm going to have to impose an assimilation into some other people's ways of behaving or expectations, imposing some harm to myself, some social, emotional, psychological harm to myself and to the development of my self-concept to not be criminalized. And that really carries a toll on children who don't fit those expectations. So you have this inclusion and exclusion that's really shaped by race, by citizenship, by policies. And we have migrant child detention. We have indigenous children in foster care, which really are the new residential schools of sort, which have not been dismantled, not in Canada, not in the US, not in Australia, not in New Zealand. They continue to carry forth that legacy. And so even though they are residential schools and processes of erasure and trauma by another name, they continue happening. And so the questions that I asked was, how have dominant cultural and legal frameworks shaped childhood? How do policies reinforce exclusionary childhood constructions? Which power structures determine who is protected or policed? And how can we define childhood to honor diverse experiences? And the last one, we'll talk about it together. But I did use critical narrative analysis, which really interrogates these dominant narratives shaping childhood. Way back when, as you can see, I combined discourse analysis with storytelling. Because when you look at discourse analysis and you think of Faircloth, for instance, there's an ascription of which discourse has power. And I didn't buy into that. I wanted to see how those power discourses were recycled uncritically into everyday narratives and stories. And really then assess the power based on how people embrace those discourses. Just because a person who is in power says something, it doesn't mean that that discourse is going to have power. And so it really combined this discourse analysis with storytelling or narrative analysis. And I used to examine policies, media, and institutional frameworks. And that's what I did here for the childhoods. And travels these traditional hierarchies of power. For whom is this powerful? According to whom? Right? How do discourses get taken up and recycled in everyday narratives? How do people use those broader discourses to justify? And are they even aware of it? Are they aware that if they are crossing this, if they are heading down a dark street at 2 a.m. and there is, my partner is a 2-meter Black man, and I'm on the other side, what side do you choose and why? And what are the narratives that are really permeating our actions if we're not even aware of them? So it is this methodological approach, as I talked about, and examines how dominant narratives shape power structures and identities, and helps uncover whose childhood narratives are dominant and whose are silenced. It challenges exclusionary practices embedded in policies and law. And that's part of it, that some of those very definitions are embedded in educational systems and in laws. And because they are, and because law is part of justice, then we come to believe that that's just, when in reality it isn't. That is a way of misusing justice to instantiate injustice through law, which is a carceral definition of justice. And then it provides a lens to analyze the intersection of race, migration, and childhood constructs. Because oftentimes we talk about children and dominant settings as if it were the normative child, without understanding that the normative child is actually numerically the minority state. So I went about the data selection along 3 categories: historical texts on childhood as social construct. How has childhood been? And so I looked from the definition of childhood since the 1500s compute today across different settings. Then legal and policy documents governing childhood. So for example, the United Nations Human Rights, but also the United Nations Commissions on indigeneity, and lots of other documents, including the, and I would have to look at my paper, but there is an Australian document that's 1997 that has to do with Aboriginal rights. And so I looked at specific, hold on, because this is on text. I looked specifically at different laws and different policies. The Australian Human Rights Commission Bring Them Home report, as well as reports from the United Nations, as well as the policy governments that govern childhood within countries, whether it is through the welfare system, social work, and so on. And the paper has a much longer list. This is just one or two examples here. And then the scholarly literature on childhood criminalization and racialization. So those were the three categories. And then in analysis, I really sought to identify the patterns, but also the silences based on the definition of childhoods historically, the historical texts. What was missing in the policies? What was being talked about? What was the reality discursively? And what was actually being enacted into actionable frameworks? And then coding themes related to racialization, criminalization, and the exclusion in childhood. So the findings, and again, very a mile high or 10,000 meters high. The findings are that there are specifically constructed boundaries of childhood, and that we need to recognize those, we need to delineate, but we need to work toward abolishing them. One of them is the racialization of childhood, and you see that in two specific things. One of them is the adultification of Black children. And the other one, and Black children, I would include Aboriginal children as well, right? Because I think that anti-Blackness is global. And then the over surveillance in schools and communities. Who is followed in a store and who isn't? For whom is it okay not to get a bag? And for whom not getting a bag may actually be a huge issue. And I talk to that to friends all the time because like within Chicago, you have to pay for a bag. And here too. And it would be the right thing, except that if you are a 17-year-old Black male and you leave the store without a bag and you didn't get a receipt, you could be accused of stealing. And so for whom is that actually a detriment and an extra toll that they pay? And for whom is it a sustainable solution? And how do we do away with that? So this over surveillance in schools and communities takes place in terms of readiness tests, of admission to kindergarten standards, of promotion, of grades, and so on. So there are tons of studies there. Then the criminalization of childhoods. There's the school to prison pipeline or nexus. Different scholars talk about it differently, but really thinking about for whom by third grade is the government predicting that they will end up in a jail cell, which should never happen. But there are a number of studies that show that by third grade, they don't know these and reading, these and math. They have an over 80% chance of being in prison, right? And then the juvenile justice disparities. Why is it that we know that tougher sentences are given to people of color versus to white people, children, youth? Many times, children from Aboriginal, from Black backgrounds are treated and tried as adults as opposed to as children. And folks like Kyle Rittenhouse are just kids. Who gets to be a kid? Who gets to be irresponsible? Why is it that Brett Kavanaugh was like, oh, he was just a boy when he raped? It's like, hold on. Is that also the case across races? And so we do have the, again, this criminalization. We have the bordering of childhoods through migration policies and through child detention. And so as we go back to the research questions, we have, how have dominant frameworks shaped childhood? So by and large, colonial and racialized histories have reinforced childhood as a tool for exclusion and dehumanization. If you are deemed to be a child or to behave in that expected way, then you're included. If you're not, it does serve as that exclusion barrier there. And dehumanization, who's deemed more human, less human, whose lives are more valuable, and whose lives are deemed disposable. And why? Is a child who is asking for money at the stoplight or the corner, is their life less valuable than a child who's excelling in school and following the rules without considering the social conditions in the history? How do policies reinforce exclusionary constructions of childhood? There are many, many ways, but one of them is how immigration laws criminalize migrant children. Not only in terms of their status, but in terms of access to healthy food, access to health care, access to education in some countries. Then which power structures determine who is protected and who is policed? There are three specific things as I looked across that were very clear. One of them is educational systems. Who's privileged in the curriculum? Who's disprivileged? Who's considered to be an artist? Who's considered to be a vandal? Is graffiti art or is it vandalism? And so those definitions really get there. Legal frameworks, whether it is the Indian Removal Act or they bring them home, really thinking about those legal frameworks that define childhood in really restrictive ways, then deem anyone who doesn't fit those legal frameworks not to be a child. And so therefore you become responsible or tried as an adult. And that bifurcation is really problematic. And then you have racial hierarchies in terms of the lighter you are and the darker you are, you're more likely to be considered a child or less likely. And you think of that, like when you think of a baby, most people would think of a white baby and not a black baby. Just like that's the archetype. But also if you search for images on the internet, you will see how that archetype is realized through artificial intelligence, through search engines, and a variety of things. So it's not that we woke up one day and said, this is who I'm imagining. Like when my oldest son was born with blue eyes, everybody in Brazil was like, oh, he's like the Johnson baby from Johnson & Johnson commercials, or the standards of beauty that exist in China, Korea, in terms of lighter skin, being more beautiful and not being in the sun. Those things are all embedded here. And so how can childhood be redefined? We have to really center justice, not criminal justice, that seeks to define who did it and what they deserve, not common law justice, that seeks to protect the entitlements and the privileges of the ruling class, but really the kind of restorative justice that understands that we're all interconnected and that we're all responsible for each other and our humanities. And so, and then agency, because children are not just passive recipients, even though we define them as innocent, as angelic, as almost like not fully human. And then cultural belonging. So in terms of legal and policy implications, I drew on literature to each, there are three different categories of implications that I'm talking about, and then we'll get to the conversation. One of them is legal and policy. So the three most important and most prevalent counter narratives to these disabling and limiting narrative of childhoods was immigration policies must protect rather than exclude children. How is it that our responsibility as citizens, as human beings, and being tied to each other gives us really bestows upon us the responsibility to care for and protect children. The justice system must shift from punitive to rehabilitation models. And part of that is that what happens if you punish someone? You may feel good about it as a society, but that person's still going to go back into society. So how is it that we actually focus on healing? How is it that we actually focus on that restorative justice in which we understand that we are interconnected? And then universal access to education and healthcare, regardless of legal status. And part of that is that we're robbing from the future when the children who are within our borders, regardless of their status, are not receiving the proper care. And so those are three high-level recommendations. In terms of educational implications, I guess there are two. Schools must integrate culturally sustaining pedagogies and center indigenous pedagogies. And part of that is that children who are white, middle class, English speaking already know and see themselves everywhere. They see themselves in scientists, they see themselves in presidents. And so how is it that we create a curriculum of counter narrative, but also a curriculum of humanization to understand that we're all interconnected, to understand the importance of intergenerational knowledge and exchange of family, of community. And teacher education needs to recognize and value diverse childhood experiences, not just by mentioning it, but by positioning children as agents, as producers, not as recipients, as fully human and capable, and not as humans in development or almost human. And then really centering decolonizing curricula, because we have been colonized by this very limiting notion of childhood that really pervades over 5 centuries. In terms of social and community implications, we need to combat the adultification and systemic criminalization of children who don't fit the childhood norm for conceptualization. We need to engage in community-based justice and care-centered policies that involve those who have been excluded and marginalized historically. And we need to honor indigenous and intergenerational knowledge systems as we design care, education, schooling experiences, whether in schools, in museums, or elsewhere. So I'm going to conclude with an invitation, which is the so what. I often think when I'm writing things like, why should people care? What do they do with this? So I invite you to interrogate childhood's boundaries, upending not only its abstract conceptualization, because it may just seem like a matter of wording, right? But how it serves as a mechanism for exclusion, for control, and for denial of humanity, denial of futures. We need to revision childhood with the recognition that it's not just a biological stage, but a social construct, often used to determine who's afforded protection, innocence, opportunity, and who's denied those very things. Through collective efforts, we really can dismantle these colonial exclusionary narratives and reconstruct childhood as a space of belonging, agency, and cultural formation. Now, this requires not only the theoretical discourse, which we're talking quite a bit today, but this is not enough. It's really thinking about implementing the tangible action. How are we implementing policies that protect all children? How do we foster inclusive educational environments? And how can we promote community-based and community-centered justice frameworks? Because what we believe is justice may not be what communities believe is justice. So it's very much coherent with the methodology here that just because somebody thinks that they know better, they may actually be inflicting colonizing practices under the guise of liberatory practices. And it is only by embracing a holistic justice-centered approach that we can ensure that all children are afforded the opportunities, care, and respect that they deserve, but the childhoods that they should be entitled to. So with that, let's stop.
Yeah, there's so much there.
Yeah.
I can't wait to read the paper.
Yeah, so the question that I'm
Yeah.
happy to engage with you, but I was thinking, like, as we engage, whose childhoods in your contacts, whose childhood count, whose childhoods count, and why?
This is very timely because we've had 2 recent elections. I'm thinking of Queensland and the Northern Territory, which were sort of the elections were fought on how do they phrase it? You know, keeping the streets safe or something, you know, that whole idea. And in the Northern Territory, everyone will correct me if I'm wrong, you know, they 10-year-olds go to jail. Yeah, and
Criminal responsibility.
criminal responsibility.
Who has criminal responsibility
Yeah.
and who is dehumanized and have their rights and
Yeah.
freedoms removed, right? Exactly, even in the title.
Yeah. And I'm interested because John Tobin is coming on to the symposium on Thursday, and you know, he's a children, he specializes in children rights and laws. And you know, just from a practical perspective, when we set up Global Studies of Childhood, the journal in 2010, we thought a practical place to start would be birth to 18, because when you're 18, in the majority of places, you become an adult. But then you find out down the line that there's this youth studies that is 15 to 24, and it's recognized in the United Nations. And then
14 to 28.
14
Just changed from 14 to
Oh,
30.
because I thought it was 15 to 24, so it's all right. Let me email.
Changed
remember.
twice in the last 2 years.
Yeah, and then you have all these other things like really silly things like going to Disneyland.
Right.
And as soon as you're 12, you have to pay full price, or
Right.
like a seat in an aircraft,
Yeah.
where it's the same seat, whether you're a child sitting in it or and all those sort of really quirky things where 14 might kick in, or and it comes back to that notion that who is excluded, because there's usually a capitalist reason for it, or a colonial reason for it. And it goes back to the original talk about conceptualizing of childhood as a phase,
Right.
which was basically economic, because they didn't want to have the children go down the coal mines or wherever.
At the same time, it was also sexual and reproductive, right?
Yeah.
When you think about 14,
Yeah.
that's around the age 13, 14 that girls first menstruate.
But it's getting younger and younger.
It is,
Yeah.
right? And so, of course, the climate
Yeah,
and culture, biology, all of that. But there are markers of oppression and denial that are there that define those very concepts.
Mm.
And so it's really arbitrary. And one of the things that video that I showed you at the very beginning showed is like, my question is, do we ever stop having a claim to childhoods? When do childhoods become something that we diminish as opposed to censor? Because it's like, oh, I hate when people say that. When people say, oh, Trump is acting like a toddler, and like you wish.
Well, I was
You
thinking about the
wish.
work of Jane Osgood wrote. She did a themed edition for Global Studies of Childhood about that. I think she called it childism, but
Oh, yeah.
yeah. I have to think back now, because it was so many editions since then. But
There's
it
also-
was a very, you should have a look at that. I did that themed edition, Mariana, because
Yes.
it was because of Trump. He's behaving like a toddler,
Yeah.
and it was an insult to the toddler.
I think that I may have, there is trying to see here. Is that the issue, that,
I don't think it's like the year of the pandemic. I was thinking.
well, but when
Yeah.
it gets published, right? Because I have a piece that was co-authored by Mark Cassar, that's from colonial legacies to inclusive futures, transforming and reconceptualizing early childhood education in Indonesia.
Yeah.
But also there's one that's about infanticide or something.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
where we
yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Infantographies and
Yes.
infanticide. And so, yes, which is an educational philosophy and theory.
Yeah.
So,
This is
all
one.
of those are really fascinating.
Yeah.
But like, who's a baby and who isn't? What's the age that you go to school? In the United States, in some places, you're ready to go to preschool. If you're diaper trained, that means if you don't wear diapers anymore. So how does that then regiment the development?
But it's who has power to have the dominant discourse, of vested interest. Because you have a lot of things that have been happening lately,
Right.
where there was, I think it was like Jeffrey Epstein, where the sort of having sex with with a girl who was 15 or 17,
Yeah.
and they oftentimes say they're 17 and they're a woman,
Right.
because they want to justify what the man has done. So it's all vested interest in who wins.
Really, sorry, I was trying to think about, just like these power structures, like the educational systems, the legal frameworks and racial hierarchies, of course, that they are really underlined. But like, when something within a legal framework informs the law,
Yeah,
and then it dictates what happens in education, and education then hierarchizes kids.
Yeah.
Then it then informs the law again, and so there's the cyclical process in terms of the legal framework, educational systems, racial hierarchies, and you could say that there is a beginning point,
yeah,
but like the legal, and I looked at a lot of legal journals to think about what is the definition of childhood, because there's so many exceptions.
But now if they're studying youth, that seems a sort of a slight shift, moving from the nomenclature becomes important. That's 14, you said, 14 to 28. That's another,
But that's brain development, that's from brain scans. That's why it keeps changing so much. It has nothing to do with what we.
but I mean, even
It's
with
in
the change in
physics.
terminology, like within that sort of overlapping zone of what's classed as childhood, that introduction of the term youth is, I think it's a deliberate act, and I don't know why, it's not my area of.
Well, I mean, it's very different when you think about youth justice
Yeah.
or child incarceration.
Mhm.
That changes how people react to it at a visceral level. And so if we think about, are youth responsible for what they do as opposed to are children responsible for what they do?
Mhm.
And in the United States, this age keeps getting lower and lower and lower. And so I do think that there is an overlap. And there needs to be an analysis of child versus youth in terms of what is the real purpose of that? How is again that bordering,
Must be solid,
bordering?
yeah. I'd like to see some of them.
The afternoon chatting with teachers about the end of the child, which has to be part of this conversation.
Yes,
Can't talk
definitely.
about childhood without talking about end of the child,
Yeah.
so. I always like this very 1.5 page by Peter Moss that he wrote for UNESCO. It's focused on a regional understanding of your end of the child. But one of the things that he says, and I just in the beginning of the paper, is that social constructions are always present and influential, but in policy making, they are usually implicit and therefore not discussed, which I think is very relevant. You know, you just talked about cycle of the
Right.
image because people just accept it.
And they accept because they're socially constructed, so they think that they're
Yes.
not being biased in the law and the policy because
Yes.
it's something that's widely acceptable. As opposed to asking, why is this being widely acceptable and is it fair?
Yeah, and just even talking with teachers about the fact that childhoods are socially constructed, they're like, oh, no. And so, it was a good conversation here. And you know, like whiteness is socially constructed. Like,
Connected to.
you know, everything's always got a hierarchy,
Same
someone's at the
here.
top and someone's
fine.
not at the top.
Oh, okay.
And so it actually was really
We can just
conversation.
close these and
And how
have
that
the other folks who are in the conversation.
think about.
Well, I
their
have to
work
go on
with
mute.
a very young child.
Where am I? What day? Sorry, Amy just told me that my computer wasn't connected to the Zoom. I thought it was through the.
So they can see me, but they can't see the room.
Really,
So I'll have to go on mute.
Yeah, it's such a nice little article because it's very concise.
But they can't hear if I go on mute, can they? Oh, right.
One of the teachers is going to have a parent get together tomorrow and she's going to ask all of the parents what is your interest at the time.
You're gonna go on mute. Who goes on mute?
But yes, absolutely. So like when the residential school
Ready with wide session.
No,
No, she couldn't
can't
find
get ahead.
No, somebody's speaking.
Mine, I'm not on mute.
Put yours on mute.
People are on that.
Oh, yes, yes.
On that dashboard presentation.
All right, can you hear that? Yeah, okay. So what I'm saying is,
This is good.
yeah, it's, tech is great when it works.
I put that system on mute.
Okay.
That's right. Can they hear us
Yes.
now?
All right.
Sonia's
All right. So what I was going to say is like, because it was believed to be beneficial for indigenous children, whether in Australia, in the US, Canada, to be raised by more developed human beings, the white race. That became law through the Indian Removal Act, through residential schools, through a variety of things. But that was never really considered whether that was best for the child. And so because we had narrow conceptualizations of childhood, then some kids were like, oh, if you are going to become a child, you have to be within this socialization of normative childhood, as opposed to recognizing the trauma that was caused and the harm.
I was going to say, and I'm looking to Catherine for verification of this, because the stolen generation were removed, not, you know, for their own good, it was said. So that was slightly different then, because it was,
Oh, no, I think those big picture stories are the same.
Mm.
We
Yeah.
remove you, your parents are incapable.
Yeah,
because
yeah.
Their skin is this colour,
Mhm.
and particularly in Australia, mostly lighter skinned children were removed because, you know, they're more able to assimilate.
mm,
But always with the white family, because that's where you'll, you know, get a better life.
but for your good, the child's good,
Mm.
yeah.
Yes.
But also because it's the benevolence of dominant families. So it's like, okay, we're not changing the system, but I'm going to do this isolated good
Mm,
here, this perceived good. So like, for example, when we think about billionaires and all of that, they may give to certain organizations, but they're not changing the system. They're continuing to amass huge amounts of money. And so there is this, there's this factor that can be linked, and I don't know that we want to go down there, but it of course is one of the factors, which has to do with the who gets to forgive and who doesn't,
Mm.
and religion. And so that our charity becomes our way of doing good, as opposed to our reorganization and centering of communities.
I think Eve Tuck in one of the Tuck and Yang writes about settler moves to
Yeah.
innocence, which I think would
Right.
be that.
mm,
Absolutely. It's actually one of the pieces that I cited in the
Yeah.
full paper,
Yeah.
because I think that that is really thinking about how is it that the very concept of innocence is such a colonial construct.
mm,
Yes.
And it's so central to the very definition of childhood.
It is.
mm.
I have a
Yes.
question. I really like your speech styles and how and why it's so concise and sharp. I really like it. And I got a question.
Yeah.
That's, what about the financial factors? Because in China, there is an interesting phenomenon that, we call it full-time daughter or full-time son. Some people, they don't have a job and they live in their parents' home, and they rely on their pension or salaries.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yes.
so their parents are forever in charge because they earn the money. It's the financial factors to define whether they are children or not,
Right.
no matter how old they are.
Yes. And so I think that that happens quite a bit through how society does not invest in young children and children. Because if we did that, if we had made child access to care and education, child access to nutrition, to mental health, to health services, then the adult would be further developed. But in a lot of ways, we end up kicking things toward the front, whether it is living with parents and living on pension, or being imprisoned, or becoming an onus to the state. Whether it is true, like in Chicago, there's this discourse oftentimes, it's like, well, if youth just thought about the cause and consequence, and it's like, actually, if you had invested in youth not being in such stressful situations and experienced such high levels of cortisol when they were little, because they were in neighborhoods that had tons of shootings and uncertainty and all of that, their brain would have been developed in a way that they actually could get the cause and consequence, but they can't because of what society did. So I think that we have like this myopic view in terms of politics, and we think in terms of political cycles, and that is really detrimental, because we keep putting band-aids to address issues that really emanate from the lack of investment in children and children's rights and the inclusion. And then we create these differentials, and then the state is paying for it. And I will tell you that in the state of Illinois, in the United States, I worked with the governor to calculate the cost of businesses not funding childcare, not funding early education. It's $1,350 lost per employee regardless of whether that employee has a child or not, because of kids getting sick, because of the lack of productivity, because of the worries and all of that. There are taxes that are lost. So there's a business case as well there in terms of like how much money our business is losing by not providing universal health, by not providing early care and education. Of course, that there are lots of debatable things, but I think that we catch up with that when kids are not necessarily well enough to individuate and become their own selves, because they have always been seen as receptacles as opposed to agents. So what does it mean if a child then is empowered to grow their agency, to grow as producers as opposed to recipients? I hope that helps. I mean, I don't know as much the context of China, although in Brazil there is a similar phenomenon in which I talked about adultification. They would talk about infantilization or childification of older kids who are dependent on parents and the state in terms of pensions.
I don't want to simplify it, but I think you might get the feeling that in China, for example, children of the sort of working class, lower socioeconomic class who haven't got a disposable income, that those children are sort of sent off to work early, sort of almost like industrial revolution age, whereas the children from the more affluent, it does almost seem to be on those grounds in terms of income.
Right.
That's in Chinese society has a specific meaning, but I know I'm overgeneralizing there, but there does seem to be something there that would be worth interrogating.
I would love for you to think about it and to talk about it in the future, because I think like you understand the concept so much better. And so those are the questions that I think are often worth pursuing, are the questions that we genuinely have and try to understand.
Because I wouldn't think it had been interrogated in Chinese, in mainland China research a lot. I think it might have been in Japan or Taiwan or somewhere, but Hong Kong, I don't know, but I think it might be something that would be worth interrogating.
Right.
It's different insights.
Class and generations.
Yeah.
Class and generation.
Yeah, by the way, I really like your narratives of the childhood narratives.
Yeah. No, it's, I think, and what I looked at, I mean, I didn't interview people. You look at 4 different sources of data, like the historical, the law frameworks, the studies of childhood and how it had been framed, and then specific case studies. And the case studies really had to do with the context of Australia and the US, or Australia, the US, New Zealand and Canada, because that's where I was coming from, like US, Canada area. And there's the Australia, New Zealand context, which are different, but have similarities as well in terms of some of the definitions of childhood and exclusion. So, but I did not look at studies within the context of China or within the context of Brazil. And so I think it's worth exploring that further, because global childhoods have to really include beyond our immediate context. I just didn't feel that I had enough knowledge to do that in a way that wasn't going to be superficial.
Just to try to choose focus more than just being in general, I think.
Yes.
What about Europe? And what do you think, Andreas and Anna and Gabriella, in terms of these types of ideas in the European context? Do they work, or are there different dimensions?
There's a lot of things that intersect, but something that made me think here was the tension between different notions to how we define colonial, racial, cultural stuff like that.
Yes, it's different.
That there are differences there, not only differences, but it opens for tension between stability and fluidity in the concepts themselves.
Right, that's true.
Yeah, and that's the Chinese example here is tipping into that. So
yeah.
I can't really expand on that now, but I think this is something that we need to explore further.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and one of the things that I would say wasn't just because I was coming here and came from the US, but also because those have a shared history of settler colonialism, right? So that is the framework whereby I am really looking at the conceptualization and limiting of childhoods within settler colonial nations. And so I would be interested in thinking about what does it mean when you may not have the settler colonial with capital S, capital C, because I think that there are settler colonialisms within European countries,
Oh,
right?
yes.
Oh, there's definitely.
I'm,
Yeah.
I'm Irish. People don't look for that ever. I mean, in Europe, you get referred to as black if you're Irish.
Right.
I think that's an important context that never gets.
Absolutely.
Mm.
It's interesting because in the United States, that really does not get taken up. And I know that there are other folks from the US, but really thinking about how Irish and Italian and Jewish people initially were not part of the white race, but they
Yeah.
became part of the white race
We're
as a
talking
way
about
of,
the tenement
yeah,
museum.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so to really create this coalition and commonality and have allegiance to those who had more money as opposed and differentiate from those that had darker skin.
Mhm.
So my oldest child is in Dublin doing his master's degree, and his girlfriend is Irish. Her mom is from Romania. And so long story short, I say like, well, being Black and having someone who comes from a similar racial hierarchy, and people are like, what do you mean? Bella's white. And I'm like, well, if you don't understand the context and if you're using your lenses to understand, but like the way that Romans, the way that travelers, the way that Irish people get labeled within hierarchies, it does have to do with that. So when we talk about those racial hierarchies, they're not just black, white, they're not just indigenous, non-indigenous. They're the gradations of distance or proximity based on whatever systems of power exist within that specific setting. And so thank you for bringing that up because, yeah, I often say like, well, they look like each other a little bit. My youngest child told my mom, like, oh, she's like his sister. If you think of Lucas as a girl, it would be Bella. But part of that is really thinking about how I say like they both had parents who were professors and their moms were like racially minoritized or devalued within the hierarchy and all of that. And so there are some commonalities there. So I think that that's part of the power of the global childhoods is to think about like, it is different, but specific situations can shed light on
Yes,
what we are doing
Yeah.
and then expanding the conversation.
that's exactly what we've been trying to do. Because we think then if you come back to your local context, it gives you new insight
Oh, yes.
to your, to your interrogations.
Right.
So that's why it's a valuable
Yeah,
way, a sort of framing of your study around global childhoods.
correct.
I was thinking about a conversation, in terms of in Aboriginal kids and look the sort of the ones that people say they don't look Indigenous, that we have that.
my daughter comes at it every day.
Yeah.
She has a public facing job where everybody thinks that they can tell her
Yeah.
about her Aboriginality.
Yeah, we were talking about that too.
Oh, we were
in the
talking
previous-
about
yeah.
that, and part of that
People
has
tell
to
you how you
do,
feel or what you look like as if you don't have a sort of opinion on that.
yeah, so it's interesting because my youngest has very fair skin, but an afro, big afro. And so it's interesting because when he was younger, people didn't think that he was my kid.
Oh, yeah.
Because,
Okay, now
right?
the nanny.
Is that, oh, absolutely. And so those, I have been, there's one specific scenario in the Upper West Side when I'm pushing my youngest up the hill from my oldest school. And this woman stops and says, I hear you go to Columbia. How much do you charge? And I was a professor there. This is my kid. But there are all of these assumptions. So again, those assumptions, those archetypes of really permeate a global context, and we need to understand how not to minimize them to one specific model, but also how to trace the network of influence in terms of the power, in terms of the frameworks, and how they affect education systems.
We have got any questions online or anything?
No, I was just
No.
about to say that.
Oh, yeah.
Are there questions online?
You, actually, me and Mariana are up there, so I just realised.
Yeah, we are.
I'm sort of in the pond.
Don't get too wet.
No, yeah. But my head's coming up the pond.
But even thinking about like, who's dressed for school? How are kids dressed for school? How is that dressed for school and ready to learn? Part of the archetype of childhood. In a similar way that the archetype of professionalism gets dispensed with adults.
Yeah.
And how those are racialized and how those are put into law in some places. Like that kids may not have puffs on their hair, or they may not have whatever it is, but part of that is like, you're criminalizing my existence. Because-
In Australia, that's what we have in our school rules.
You do?
It's in all school rules.
Wow.
Children are only allowed to have natural hair color.
What is
Who
that?
decides on whose hair is a natural hair color?
Right.
Yeah, like
So
so
if
blue
it-
head.
You're not allowed to.
Mm.
So the teachers don't dye their hair either.
Well,
Yeah, but
and
see,
hair has to be done a
It's
certain
maybe
way.
it's just
but that, I was gonna say, that's an
Can't
improvement
touch
on
your
when
hair.
I went to school, where if your hair touched your collar, you had to tie it up.
That's still a rule.
Is it?
And
So
so
that-
those sorts of things is like, for whom is it easy to tie up your hair and for whom it isn't, right? And also not only that, but like, what are some of the policing there? And who gets to decide? Who gets to decide whether, as you just said, as does the teachers not dye their hair?
Yeah, well, there was a well-known case of a principal cutting a child's hair.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Wow.
Yeah, I think that's very
because
few. They could inform,
Right,
but plenty of cultural practices where people wear their hair long.
right.
But why is there even a need to conform, to regulate that in a school context? That's what I don't even understand before that, like, yeah, exactly,
I mean, I teach in a studio, and so there's actually no HNS required,
yeah.
but outside of that.
Yeah, you can understand it if it was like
Yeah.
a cooking
Wear a
place.
hairnet if you're doing cooking.
Yeah.
But how is that, in a way, again, a tool for denial, for control, for exclusion?
Mm.
Because you get to determine what environments is that okay, what environments is it not? And if the issue is hygiene, how does that play into archetype of people of color and indigenous people not being clean enough?
You know, I was thinking about when you were talking about the sexualization of Black
Yes.
girls, and I was thinking about all those American white people who put their kids in beauty pageants. And I mean,
In beauty.
in beauty pageants, there was a case
Yeah.
many years ago, I'm going like 40, 50, about that John Bonet Ramsey.
Yeah.
She was, and then,
Yeah.
and I mean, I just remember, I think that was the first time ever I knew those type of pageants existed. I didn't even
Yes.
know they existed. And I remember thinking, like, why would you do that to your child?
Yes.
And it's an interesting paradox.
Yes.
That of the sort of the
Right.
sexualization of the Black child, whereas the white child, not idolized, but it's sort of celebrated or something.
It's the cult of innocence.
Yeah.
Right? You look like an angel. you
Yeah,
look
an
like a
angel,
good-
yeah.
Yes, a good person. You're playing classical music.
Yeah.
You are propagating world peace kind of thing.
Yeah. Or the
And-
like the later beauty competition, like
Right.
Miss America, Australia, whatever.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it does have to do, I mean, we didn't get into misogyny and all of that here, but I think that like within the context of childhoods, there is the role of the archetype of the child, and when do those who identify as boys and those who identify as girls, are there differences in terms of ages and expectations in caregiving and stepping and towing around that adultification because of societal conditions?
Yeah. And I mean, we might even get into the situation with the trans
Oh,
in
yes.
America at the moment.
We don't want to get into anything in America at the
No, but
moment. It's just
where
terrible.
there's, that sort of area that before the most recent rulings in terms of the fluidity of sexuality
Right.
in those years that are where
Right.
children are quite
Right.
vulnerable. And then there's sort of people that come in like Elon Musk and
Right.
say, that he was tricked into his the situation where the gender affirming.
But there are a lot of
so
limiting narratives
Yeah.
right now in the United States. So one of the things that we had done is we had at Erickson Institute our application had multiple gender identities, including none of the above, and they could enter and all of that. And now federal law has said that if you don't have just the two genders, that you won't get federal funding. And so that those are the, as you can think about it, some of those archetypes then get encoded into law and they inform the system. And so again, it starts at different points, but I think we would be naive not to think about the role of law, of enforcement, and the role of capitalism and racial capitalism within all of these.
I actually think capitalism drives a lot of this.
Oh, yeah. I didn't look into that broader framework. I really wanted to look at childhood, like how has childhood been defined, like from 1500 until now in Europe, in different areas in the United States. And so I really tried to look at that and really thought about what discourses had power in terms of defining childhoods, who was centered, who was silenced based on what we know. And really, how has childhood been used as a way of denying it? And when you think about it, like before there were birth certificates in America, children of enslaved Africans were deemed to be much older because they seemed older. And so all of a sudden you may have an 11-year-old that is treated as an adult because they don't have a birth certificate. And so those are the sorts of things that indigenous populations, that Black populations have endured. And now they may have that piece of paper, but have the changes in society happen? Or are those illuminating our imaginaries of childhood?
Some of the work that our lab has been doing is around Shakespearean language. And we have not explored this, we explore Shakespearean femicide and misogyny. But it'd be interesting to think about Shakespeare and the child, because Shakespeare uses the archetype of the changeling. So the child that moves the plot, but moves between male and female. And also, so one of the things that our lab does in the Shakespearean work is look at the implications for language in contemporary society. So we've done some work around Othello on trial. And so what Othello was a wife killer. If you actually talk about femicide and red Miss Rage, which grossly Trump also evoked more recently, that language is built into, so when we talk about colonization, we don't use that language of Shakespeare to think about that version of colonizing language. But it has me thinking about exploring Shakespeare's use of child, because the children are mostly kind of almost mythological in the way that they move about the stage. And the archetype of the Shakespearean child is the Cupid. And so I wonder if that, I mean, it's a nice piece of work. Maybe we should pick that up. Swiss Lab might need to have a look at child and Shakespeare, but it's an interesting thing to.
It really is.
Up there thinking Sarah was up there then.
No, Yvette
is there. No, I think that absolutely. I think that as we think about so many of these representations, how are they shaping and how are they defining some of
the
those?
concept of race comes from Shakespeare.
Oh,
and
yes.
it plays out every day. But so I think the concept of childhood from Shakespeare definitely be looked at.
And then how do everyday texts like holiday songs reinscribe the normalcy of rape, the normalcy of a lot of things that are deeply problematic, but we put forth? And then how is it also that across time, children have been, children of color, indigenous children, Black children have been represented in song and books by animals, not always in a negative way. When you think about Blackbird, which was McCartney's, and then Beyonce just took it over. It was about the Blackbird, as in Ruby Payne, that was learning how to fly and all of that. But like, it took Beyonce actually getting Black women to sing and to be very purposeful about, like, for people to even be aware of it. So why is it that we talk about those who don't fit the archetype as animals? whether it is in terms of sexuality and Tango makes three,
Mm.
whether it is in terms of Blackbird, that's seeking freedom, why not a Black girl? And so, those are also things to think about. I haven't in length, except to say that, of course, in terms of males, the bestiality has been a central concept, and it has been used in ways of getting people to incite their hate and nationalism in terms of, but yeah,
The black Moor in every Shakespeare play is always
exactly,
the bad guy. It's built into the way we
Yes.
understand black men.
exactly.
I was thinking about the powers, for the first, the power structure of age. Often when we think about, and also generation, of course,
Mhm.
like age, like a chronological
Right.
age like that, but to see it as the power structure, it's sort of something that
Right.
resembles with your presentation here, I think, and also just looking at the case of Sweden today, where we used to have, you know, you could be convicted as a criminal when you were 18 before. Now, because we have, unfortunately, had a lot of gang criminals, so, and they get younger and younger. So now the age limit has turned to 15, but there is a discussion now to make it even less, like 14.
So how is it that
it's
the shifting of
talking
the,
about laws?
Yeah,
So it's,
Yes.
so
exactly.
what is a child there? So
Yeah.
that was the one thing, and the about
And what
age.
is justice,
Yes,
right? In
justice.
terms of like, is justice punitive? Is justice carceral? Or is justice healing and restorative?
Exactly. So this
Because if it is
happening.
healing and restorative, do we have to lower the age?
Mm.
And if we lower the age, what is the harm that we're inflicting on children?
Yeah, because they are just using younger and younger.
Right,
children.
So
exactly.
It's also disproportionately affected
Right,
by those choices.
absolutely.
So in this country, most states have the criminal responsibility of 10.
Yes.
So
Is it
from 10.
Ten?
Oh,
So surprise, surprise, surprise.
Yeah.
Who do you think is the biggest population of children aged 10 incarcerated?
I can tell you, because I read plenty of articles that talked about the
Yes.
disproportionate
That's it.
incarceration of Aboriginal children in Australia.
That's right.
But then I was thinking about those boys, you know, who murdered James Bolger in England, and the shock of that one event, and then how the reaction to that, where something, I don't know, I can't remember what they did now, but it, you know, but it's visceral, wasn't it?
But then we didn't have that visceral reaction when a 10-year-old playing with a gun in a park, then you're right, gets murdered,
I know.
right? So
Yeah, it's the
what
hypocrisy
are
and the
we,
paradox,
yeah, and also what are we using as our own emotional reaction? And how are those related to the very conceptualization of childhood?
Yeah, so much here to think about. I'm just conscious of the time.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
No, go ahead,
Just
please.
one
No, please go.
No, please.
last thing. Because we talked a lot about childhood and also about the child and so forth. But I was thinking about across time that we have certain within the studies of childhood,
Yes.
very often certain positions,
Yes,
subject positions
Yes.
become, gain prominence.
yes.
So we have, for instance, the competent child.
Mhm.
That, oh yeah, there's always this, I think maybe we need to move beyond the competent child or think also critically on these very idealized positions.
Right.
We need to look critically also at them, I think. In gender, I mean, there's so many good things about it, of course.
Yes.
But there is also, very seldom discussed it as that these positions also hold power structures. For instance, gender, we were talking about gender before.
Right.
Who is the competent child? Very often
And who
a girl.
defines competence?
Yeah, but
Is it competence in terms of having a connection to the land, of having intergenerational connections, of being able to pass a talking stick and respecting each other's times, or is it competence in terms of competition?
What is non-competence and so forth? So within early childhood education, at least, there's very little discussion about this. And maybe we should discuss it more in families as well.
Right.
how we raise our boys and daughters and or other.
Yes.
Mm.
categories.
Yes, I will say to
It is
return,
not a neutral position.
yeah,
No.
to
It is
return
not
to
a
my
neutral
mom.
position.
I will say that when I divorced, my youngest was 8 and he was responsible for doing the laundry. And my mom said, can I please pay someone to go and do that? And I'm like, no, it's his responsibility, as it is Lucas's responsibility to load the dishwasher, and whomever cooks does not, those sorts of things. And so part of it is like, what are the expectations that we have? How are those gendered?
Yes.
And how are we reifying this archetype, this idea of childhood? If we expect a 12-year-old girl to babysit, but we don't trust a 13-year-old boy to babysit.
The thing is also that actually, at least if you look, for instance, early childhood education, or you can look at even older children, that actually both boys and girls do these things.
Yeah.
Both
Right.
boys and girls are competent. If they are doing whatever we mean by competent actions, but they do this.
Right.
The trouble is, the problematic thing is that adults don't see that boys, for instance, do all these kind, caring actions.
Yeah.
But they see it in girls and they expect it from girls, so we foster them in different
Yeah,
ways.
and
But
there's a
both
piece.
boys and girls do it, so it's important to.
One of the pieces that I reviewed for this article was by Nate Bryan, and he talks about how Black boys taking up more caring and emotional personas in play get problematized and how that excludes them.
Yeah.
And so that was really interesting, because oftentimes we think about them being constructed as dangerous, whatever, but like, what happens when that is the case?
Yeah.
And how are teachers then worried about boys because they're pretending to be girls and so on, especially within the context of being Black. So it's, I want to say it's a 2020 piece, but that would be super interesting to look at.
Yeah.
Well, we might just very quickly wrap up and say thank you very much, Mariana.
Thank
And we're
you.
so sorry that you won't be able to be here.
I know, same, but
So
I,
glad that you-
yes.
Glad that you could come.
Yes, I'm happy to have engaged with each and every one of you. I'd love to take a look at that
Yeah,
if you're willing to. I'll give you my card and you can email it to me. if
Can I
that's all right.
also just say that we wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for Amy and Karen for their organizational skills. And we couldn't have done it without them. And so thank you to you both. Thanks for flying across the pond.
And my apologies to the people online. I realized about 45 minutes in that all they could see was me.
They couldn't see the PowerPoint.
Nope. I
Ah.
could not see the
But I thought when I connected to that outlet,
I think the issue was that Zoom wasn't turned on. Yeah, I think your computer might not have.
but I
But we
thought,
will have a great audio
we would need to
recording.
double check because I thought when I was connected, I thought when I.
I think you only shared slides. Not the Zoom.
Oh,
That's why I couldn't press record.
thanks for coming, Jason.
Thanks, Jason.
All right, see yous. Thank
Sam
you so much.
Burgess has been our, thanks, Jason,
Mariana.
been our grad dip. Sam Burgess.
I'm not sure.
We have
Yes.
Oh, Sam. Oh, Sam. I still, can you hear me, Sam? Because I still use your multi-literacies assignment number 1. As a Samantha. And I said, this is Samantha. I would say Samantha because, I didn't like to say Sam. And so you and Cara and Lauren from the year before you. So thank you so much for doing such a wonderful assignment. 100%, you got 100%.
Thank you.
It's such a
Very much.
Oh, we're gonna send you the PowerPoint.
Yeah. we can send you the
Yeah, I've got it on my computer, so I can get it to Amy, who can circulate it to the people that were online. Yeah.
Oh, that would be great. Thank
This is
you.
your face, Sam. I've only seen it on video.
I know. Well, you're not far away. We might pass each other in the street
And
one.
Mary and Bill loved it, and they loved you. I took yours and Cara's over to show them. They said it was incredible.
Oh, thank you. I'm so thrilled. It's really nice. All the effort you put into the work that it's yeah.
It's good.
That's really
Nice
good.
to see you again.
You too.
Have you done STEM learning ecologies?
Yes, that was my
Oh,
first.
Dan, I'm going to do that in turn 4 with Jason, so.
You
Take care, lovely to see you.
too. Take care.
So hang on, what do I do now? Do I